Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for staying with us to the end of the Women's Forum. This will be our closing panel. I'm delighted to be moderating this one this evening. I'm from The Economist. My name is Pamela. I run the Southeast Asia Economist Corporate Network. So my role really today is to manage the conversation that you have here on stage in front of you. Before I do that, I just thought I'll share a little bit of headline thoughts from The Economist. I start with a story. Last year, we produced The World If publication in 2018. We do this every year, and really is some of the scenarios that we see unfolding in business, in politics, in the histories, and in technology. In the 2018 edition of The World If, we envisaged a world in 2069, 50 years from now, where by then, half of global CEOs are women. In our article, we have reviewed how the business world had finally reached a milestone and what we needed to do, or what we had changed along the way in order to reach this milestone 50 years from now. We imagined that the ball had started rolling in 2018, last year. 7% of government leaders, 15% of board members, and about 3% of CEOs were female. Of America's Fortune 500 companies, 23 were led by women. In Britain, the leaders of the FTSE 100 included more Davids. There were 8 Davids as top leaders of the companies than women. There were 7 women. The World Economic Forum calculated in 2017 that given how slowly things were moving, it would take 217 years to close the gender gap. Even though, at that time in 2017, women in the rich world were as educated, sometimes even more educated than men, and made up 47% of the global workforce. And this is because the initial attempts to fix this gender leadership gap really focused on quotas, and a lot of these quotas for board members had little trickle-down effect. So what we did in our article was we imagined what might have changed, or what is the dynamics, or what are the storyboards that we can tell to envisage this world 50 years from now. We thought that some of the things that needed to change were that firms were pressed to explain some of their gender wage gaps. Men got involved because men today run about 95% of companies, 80% of decision making is made by men. We need them to be on our side in order to make these transformational changes. The public got involved. People were enraged about the Me Too movement. They boycotted consumer companies that had shown sexual discrimination or harassment in those companies. Policymakers, regulators, all of them got involved. Journalists got involved. They pulled out all the bad companies and they put them up for public debate. Think tanks, research governments published a gender index where we rank companies based on how well they were doing in closing the gender gap. Governments got involved. They stepped up. They helped improve childcare, preschool education, and make that accessible and affordable to all people. And they made sure that they equalized their responsibilities on parenting. So, for example, they did policies where they maybe scaled back a little bit of maternity leave and really pulled up paternity leave, really enforcing the idea that parenting is 2 people in those families. Governments also pushed schools to raise enrollment in STEM education. They also boosted enrollment in many of the tech sectors, in computing, and so on. And at the start, business leaders, what they wanted to do was to raise good publicity. So they got on board and they hired more CEOs because they wanted that good publicity. But with time, they recognized that actually having a diversified leadership board really helped push performance. And sometimes it was not just about the personality of the woman leader or the personality of those board members that are female, but really the diverse environment that allowed those women to be pushed to the top. We saw that companies then really started pushing this agenda because of profitability, because they saw that by having more diversified boards, they could make better decisions. So that was the world that we envisioned at The Economist, what it took in 50 years, what we need to do today in order to get to a world where 50% of CEOs are female. I'm delighted this afternoon to be hosting this panel so that we can talk about this. Where are we today and how can we get to that world? That was The Economist's view. I just want to now turn to the panel and ask, what are the steps that we need to take today to get that diversified, inclusive workforce that we are looking to the future. And not just in the workforce, in politics, in civil society, in academia, and all the sectors that we can think of. I thought I'll start with Jerome. Jerome always starts from the top. You know, politics always puts the conversation on the table and really shapes that conversation. How optimistic are you that governments and politicians are shaping that conversation in the right way, in the right direction, to push us to 50%, or you can pick a high number, in 2067?
Thank you, Pamela. I'm just going to show how I'm optimistic, but first I'd like to thank you all the organization, because it's a great privilege for me to speak in front of this great high-level audience. And it's a pleasure for me to present in few words what Paris region is, like a PR of Paris region. Paris region is the first region in Europe, first region in France, of course, sharing around 13 billion euros budget. Paris region is around 50% of French GDP, and very involved into transportation, economic development, high school education, etc. So it's one of the major regions in the world. And this major region in the world is managed today by a very powerful woman who's called Valérie Pécresse. And that shows how the political level changed in France today, because one of the first regions in the world, you know, is managed by a woman. Those things change in France, and things change in Europe as well. As you know, it's not only Angela Merkel who managed a great country in Europe, but also Theresa May, as you know, but it was before, of course, Bojo, but Theresa May and Angela Merkel were two very high-level prime ministers, and you have a lot of women today who take some high-level responsibility in Europe. But also I would like to talk in few words about my view for the future of humankind, and especially to the place of women into society. And my view is maybe AI and especially quantum research should be a very good way to enhance and speed up women's accountability. I mean that in the 90s, when the AI research began, that was, of course, a lot of men who trust the research of IA. But today, that's a great challenge we face too for quantum research, and maybe, Pamela, should be the good way for women to take the lead to the quantum research, because that's definitely the next big thing.
Thank you. I have many questions on that, but I'd like my other panelists to comment before we proceed. So if I could turn to Helen, please. Helen, New Zealand is very well known as being one of the model countries to look to where they have supported women in leadership. What is your perspective on what is distinctive about the New Zealand system that has allowed women to rise up or to be supported in their roles?
Well, for more than half the last 22 years, New Zealand has had women prime ministers. Right. And we're now on the third, and she's fantastic. I think there's only one other country that kind of equals that, and that is Iceland, which had a woman president and has had two women prime ministers and has one now. And they're all fantastic as well. I mean, what is in the water in New Zealand? Firstly, last year we commemorated the 125th anniversary of women winning the right to vote in New Zealand. That was 1893. That was 25 years ahead of the United Kingdom and a whole lot of other countries. And I put it down to New Zealand being, in every respect, quite a young country without hidebound traditions. You know, we were the last significant land mass that human beings discovered to settle, with indigenous people coming in the 13th century, by which time there were already great cathedrals in France. You know, we're a young country. And once ideas get traction in New Zealand, they can move quite fast. I think you know, my generation was the one that made the breakthroughs. We were reasonably slow after 1893, but by the time I was coming up in the political system, which was, you know, the early 80s, I was elected, it was time for women, and we started to grow in numbers. I'll tell you what made the biggest difference for women's representation, and that was changing the voting system. Because if you stick with voting systems which have a single member constituency, the stereotype around that has always been of the man with a wife and 3 children, and the man's the member, not the wife. And so when we went to proportional representation in party lists, then suddenly the parties were confronted with the reality that if they put up lists that didn't have women prominent in them, why on earth would women want to vote for them? So that really accelerated the representation of women in our parliament, and it now stands at 40.8%. We haven't had special measures like quotas, but changing the electoral system had a huge difference. Now, you know, New Zealand has seen women hold just about every significant position in the society. We have our 3rd woman Governor General, which is nominally, you know, head of state representing the Queen. We're on the 2nd Chief Justice, who's female. Women have run the biggest company, the head of the law profession, the medical profession, you name it. Women have done everything. But we still have issues. You know, we have a pay gap still, low compared to many, at about a 9% gap, and we do have issues of domestic violence, which tragically every country has. But I think what's very powerful in New Zealand now is that girls and young women see these role models. You know, when I was Prime Minister, which was a 9-year stretch, which is quite a long time, the stories used to be told, you know, of boys saying to their mothers, "Can a boy ever be Prime Minister, Mum?" Well, yes, about half the time. But I just think that having those visible role models is so important, because it is hard to be what you can't see. Mm-hmm. And if girls can see themselves in the leadership of their country and the prominent ministers and leaders in all walks of life, it really does help accelerate the momentum towards gender equality.
And it is the most visible role in the country, and that could help with inspiring leaders in other sectors, whether it's business or civil society or academia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, you know, the girls can do anything. Now, of course, you know, women still run into issues, and I mentioned domestic and other violence. Of course, you know, #MeToo has hit New Zealand too, and has been seen to be, you know, an issue in some sectors. One particular law firm had a lot of adverse publicity, but I think the feeling was it wasn't just there, nor just in the law. So we still have to fight those battles. But look, the positive thing about Me Too is that it has brought on another wave of feminism. You know, the first wave fought for the vote. The second wave fought, you know, for women to be able to come in and rise in every sector in the society. And this wave, as I see it, is saying, let's take away all these hidden barriers, the ones that make us lose confidence, the ones that, you know, threaten us in a sexual and gender-based way. We've got to deal with those barriers. So once it's out in the open, you can deal with it. It's harder to deal with it when it's still in the shadows.
Thank you. If I could turn to KP, please. You've held directorships across a wide range of organizations, some public institutions, some private institutions, predominantly in Asia, but also in the UK now with Diageo. What do you see as what is your perspective on the critical ceilings that are preventing women from being on these board directorships or on these global boards as well as Asia boards? In Singapore, we have a very poor record, and I know you know that quite well.
I think that generally there are, in my view, 3 sort of stages one has to go through for companies, for societies, in order to achieve true gender equality. And ironically, I think the 3rd stage is probably the most difficult. The first stage is to completely obliterate overt discrimination. I mean, you can't imagine there was a time when people would actually say women are not fit to be in positions of management. They should just look after the home. That's not that many years ago. So now every single CEO will talk the talk that women should be able to be in management as much as anyone else. Then the second step was to remove the corporate barriers and to create the enabling initiatives so that women could compete in the marketplace. Better maternity and paternity rights, childcare centers and creches within companies, work-life balance, flexible hours, the whole lot. A lot of company CEOs have also adopted that. The last part, which is to really sort of talk the talk and walk the walk now, it's more difficult. And I think the most difficult stage here is one where a company can actually itself realize that for its own self-interest, having gender diversity will increase the resilience of a company, will improve the strategic breadth of a company, and is overall not just something you should do to be a do-gooder, but it actually improves the entire strength of the company. Once you get the boardroom directors and everybody recognizing that, then there is a true transformation. Now, you mentioned I'm on the board of Diageo. I just found out just a few minutes ago that Diageo was just voted, and I don't know by whom, by an international agencies or whatever, as being the second best company in the world, with Accenture as #1, for gender diversity. And I can see it in the board. We've got 50% women, and particularly for me as an Asian, which is also being an outsider. So in a way, I'm a male, but I'm an outsider to the white male board. And I can actually see that because of my own ethnicity, I bring a richness and depth of experience to the board. And I see all my women directors bring a huge benefit to the boards, and Diageo's management team are all heavily sort of numbered by women, and it's no longer something that Diageo does because it wants to get a high ranking for gender diversity. It's because doing this actually makes Diageo a truly much more competitive in the marketplace. Now, the problem is in Asia, most companies are willing to no longer have discrimination. They now have a lot of enabling practices, but the last part, I don't think most male CEOs, chairmen of companies, recognize that it is in their self-interest to have greater gender diversity. And I don't know how long it will take to cross that gap.
Thank you. I have more questions on that too, but I would like to get to Gabrielle. I'd like to tie it to the comment that Jerome made in his opening remarks, where he talked about the advent of AI and the new economy that we're moving towards. Why do you think it is so important? Do you agree with that with Jerome, and maybe you could share a little bit more of your perspective? Is it more important now than ever to be talking about the issues of diversity? Is this the right time to be having those conversations? As Helen mentioned earlier, it was her generation, it was time for women diversity. Is it time for the rest of the world?
Well, I think it's high time that we build a really inclusive world, to build on what was said before. And sorry if I sound a bit negative or pessimistic, but what I see around us is fears, trade wars, egoism, populism. And all of this I don't like. And I see climate change. And I see that artificial intelligence will drive our future, but that we've not yet fixed the bias in artificial intelligence. So yes, it's time that we do something, because we are responsible for the future generations. What kind of a world are we going to give them? If I take our situation in Europe, we've enjoyed peace for 7 decades. But will it last for our children? If I take women's rights, we've seen that they're progressing, no doubt. But if I take an example, we see that girls outpace boys in education, but there is still a gender gap in employment, in entrepreneurship, and in public life, except in New Zealand. Like pay. How can we accept that women get paid 70 or 80% of what a man make for a similar job? So I think it's high time that we build a more inclusive world, that we realize that the world we live in was built by men, and that it's high time everybody has a seat around the table. Young generation, women, and that, you know, everything is more diverse. So as a member of a big global company, I think that corporates have a role to play and that we have things we should do. First, we should take visible commitments. And if I take the example of Publicis, we've committed to have at least 40% of female at our executive committees. We've linked incentive for top management to diversity, in particular where we need more women, like in technology, for example. Second thing is to join forces, and that's what the Women's Forum is doing. And when we see the SEO champion that is taking place tomorrow, when we see what we are doing on supplier diversity, I think this is exactly the kind of stuff companies should do. Of course, work with local governments to raise awareness. So I don't know if you want to discuss again on quotas or gender pay gap, etc. But this is typically an area where law has a key role to play. And I will end with two things. One is zero tolerance. We should not accept anything that is contrary to our values. When it's about harassment, when it's about non-equal pay, when it's about discrimination, we should just say no. And we should promote soft skills. And this is also an answer to the growing weight of technology, artificial intelligence, etc. Soft skills are an area where women can make a difference, maybe more easily. We've talked a lot today about, you know, their ability in problem solving, their agility, their ability in listening, their judgment. So all of this, I think, is extremely valuable. And if you allow me, I will quote Jack Ma. No, seriously, seriously. We need to be teaching our children values, believing, independent thinking, teamwork, care for others.
Thank you. If I could, and you have a theme of AI and technology and science and engineering. May I just press both you and Jerome on this point? Actually, women are the least represented in those fields. If you look at science and technology, they're very lowly represented. In Silicon Valley, there are a very low percentage of women there. And in science fields, in schools as well, they are not encouraged as much to excel in those subjects as men are, or boys at the time. And in many cases, they leave school not having the same confidence about their abilities, even though they had those skills. Quite often, it is because boys are encouraged very heavily to excel in those subjects. So I do think there is a problem if we want, or we see that a future where women are very heavily participating in the development of AI or the development of the new technology. At the moment, it doesn't seem as though they can get there because they're not entering those fields in the same way that men are. Jerome, yes?
Can I have a slightly
Absolutely.
contrarian view to that, or not contrarian, but slightly different perspective? I think it is entirely true that the STEM sciences are dominated by men. And to the extent that AI is an actual tool, then it's very likely that the practitioners of these tools are likely to be men. Mm-hmm. However, I think we cannot fail to recognize that the social impact of AI, by taking away a lot of the routinized work, we are actually potentially creating a society where other attributes are going to become more important. And these attributes are attributes which women, in fact, have been very strong in, where the AI would take away a lot of the technical part of work. And it will require more holistic skills, ability to collaborate, ability to be collegial, ability to negotiate within people, and so on. So I think women should not look at AI as if the representation of women in the AI sciences means that women are going to be suffering from AI. I think women should look at the social results of AI and how it could actually create a work environment where women's inherent attributes are perhaps better brought to the forefront than before. So there's huge opportunities also arising from the social impact of AI.
Absolutely, and it ties in with Gabrielle's point about soft skills and developing those soft skills and recognizing those as very strong attributes. But I just wanted to ask if Jerome, you had also wanted to weigh in on this because you started us going on this topic. Do you want to elaborate a little bit about what you're doing in France, or where do you see it going in Europe? I agree with Kongping that absolutely there's a lot of it frees up a lot of the routine work that can allow us now to focus on other things like interpersonal skills. And if you look at the data of women in Google or Facebook, those are actually very high. They're one of those companies that fare quite well on the diversity scale, and it shows to Kongping's point that the application of it or the innovation of it, actually women have a very strong shot at being part of that.
Thank you, Pamela. To enlarge the discussion, I just would like to share my view about the research in women generally. Finally, you know, society, classical society, I mean, expect women into research into medical sector, social, sustainability, but never about very technical sector as artificial intelligence, especially deep learning, or quantum research. And it's the reason why this personal investment from women shows the evolution of the society. And I think that's my view, that quantum research will be the next big thing. And probably the investment of women into quantum research shows how much the world become equal between men and women. And one more field we can examine is probably the relationship between CEO, a woman CEO, and a deputy who is a man. You know, I have a personal experience for that, because I'm the first vice president of Paris region, and the president is a woman. As I'm sure I'm a negotic man, you know, if you see what I mean. But it's a great pleasure to work with Valérie, you know. She's the chief, you know, she's the leader. But I love working with Valérie. And you know, if you can consider these two very important fields. First, quantum research for women, and the relationship between men and women when the woman is the CEO and the man is the deputy.
I would like to take you up on that, because there has been a small backlash, not big, not very significant, but a small backlash on this idea of feminism. I have friends who would tell me, come on Pam, this has gone too far. You know, now I don't know how to behave around women, and some of them do feel that sometimes they're overtaken because of sometimes poorly enforced quota systems, that they're overtaken by women because the company had a quota or had a target, and the men are overlooked because they wanted to promote a woman. But it's important to have the men on our side. So how do we prevent this backlash from happening? How do we navigate that conversation so that people understand that there are values outside of individual jobs or individual targets that we are striving for as a society to be more diversely represented?
What I think is probably we, and should be the ones forum can do that, you know. We should find a way to discuss about this kind of relationship inside the society, inside the firms, and inside the political organization, right? Just to show how it's going on, and how the relationship between men and women is going on in the leadership. And of course, Women's Forum for Asia, but even for Women's Forum for Europe, and especially in France, you know. But for us, you know, in France, Pamela, it's a great challenge we're facing today. This question of relationship in the leadership between men and women, and in the other way, if you see what I mean, you know. Woman is a leader, and man is deputy.
Did you want to?
No, just very simply, inclusion and diversity doesn't mean 100% women. And the only point is really to be balanced. But the truth is that today, if you look for a woman, it's still slightly more difficult. I can give you an example. When we launch leadership and development training within our company, we ask the CEOs to send candidates. And guess what? On the list, 75% men. So we send the list back and we say, no, we would like 50-50. And it comes back with 50-50. But that's just the reality. It doesn't mean that we want to exclude men, but we want to give women a chance that they didn't have for some time.
Maybe I'll press Helen on this point too. It is well known sometimes that women politicians face sexist remarks, or sexism is prevalent in some political cultures. I'm thinking, for example, of high-profile cases in Australia, where Julia, the different types of Julias, whether it's Julia Gillard to Julia Banks, they have been complaining about discrimination against women in politics. How do you deal with that? How do you think we should deal with that? Not just politicians, but the society. And also, how do we get men in politics to be instigators of that change?
Well, of course, men have to be champions of change, right? And UN Women has run a campaign for several years, He for She. And it will recognise he for she's as those who go the extra mile to really support and promote women. And I think, you know, the issues that women face in politics are also issues that women face coming up to the, you know, senior positions in other walks of life as well. And one of those issues is that strength tends to be perceived differently when a woman is strong as against when a man is strong. And I've often commented on this because strength is always admired in men. But with women on the way up, it's so often dismissed as, well, they're tough and they're bossy and they're not very nice. It's somehow unwomanly, unfeminine. And so, you know, we're really breaking through those kinds of stereotypes to come up to the top and be judged on our own merits. Because if you weren't strong, of course, you'd be dismissed as weak and cowering and not able to do the job. But it is difficult. So, yes, women in politics have had to face all that. I certainly have myself. Julia Gillard was a strong woman and pretty vigorously attacked. I've seen other kinds of gender-based criticism as well. For example, I know there are New Zealanders in the room, and some may remember in our last election campaign when Jacinda Ardern was coming up as the leader of the opposition. She faced questions in mainstream media on 2 occasions as to, do you intend to have a baby when you're Prime Minister? Now, who would ask a man whether he intended to start a family? You see, all the assumptions behind this are that, oh, well, it wouldn't matter if a man and his partner were going to start a family because the wife would look after the children. But if it's a woman who's aspiring for the top job, well, how can she do it? Because she would have to look after the children. I mean, it's just so ridiculous. And Jacinda had to stare that down. Now, recently, there's been another little altercation where the leader of the opposition, who is a man with 3 young children, accused Jacinda of being a part-time Prime Minister. And that was pandering to a stereotype that because she was a mother with a young child, she couldn't be giving her full time to the job. But no one turns around and questions him and says, well, you've got 3 young children. Are you a part-time leader of the opposition? Mm-hmm. You see, so we're still breaking through some quite basic stereotyping and stigmatizing issues like that.
It's not just in politics.
It's right through, right?
Yeah.
It's in your profession, it's in business, whatever. How can they do the job? They've got all these,
exactly.
They've got these small children.
Especially when you're in Southeast Asia or you're in China, and I have managing directors telling me, Pam, I cannot do this job unless I work 12 hours a day, 15 hours a day. How can a woman do that? And so if I want my team to be able to do that, I need to hire men. But my question to them is, why is not you taking care of your kids and the women coming up and spending those 14 hours? And maybe I could turn to KP then. How can business leaders change that narrative so that they can also change the public mindset around what the role of the women is in society?
I think there's a danger you touched upon about alienating men. I think a lot of men actually are very good at heart, and they actually do believe in in gender diversity and gender equality. And some of the problems that they have are within themselves. I've mentioned the inherent comfort zone that men have to choose people whom think like them, who act like them. And it's very often a subconscious bias. And I think the way to change this is not through legislative quotas, which every company has to have. Because then, in my view anyway, I think you end up with quite a lot of resentment on the part of the men. And you might get also on boards women who are there who may not necessarily be contributing the full amount that they should be doing because the quota is established too quickly and so on. But that's a very, very controversial topic right now. And it's also true that without those quotas, Asian companies have really not come up to meet the aspirations that they're supposed to have. Mm-hmm. In my view, I think for men anyway, it's to be convinced that it is for the good of the enterprise itself that there be gender diversity and diversity in and of itself as a value. Mm-hmm. Once they are convinced of that, I think you find a lot of the barriers dropping. But until you can change that, which is a cultural value, it's a psychological value, then the danger if the women's movement goes too strongly is that you get resentment on the part of men. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily in the long term going to be a good thing. I have advocated that for Singapore and for elsewhere, the UK model of naming and shaming is much better than the blunt quota, which is really like a blunt instrument. When you name and shame, what it means is basically the stock exchange of a country would essentially say, each company, please set up your own target mm-hmm. for how long it would take you to achieve your own targets for gender diversity. Mm-hmm. When you set that up, then you have to every year report in your annual report what you are doing to achieve those targets. Yeah. And a lot of journalists, women activists on boards and activist investors would basically hold companies' feet to the fire and say, you have not achieved what you claim to have achieved. I think that kind of social pressure, if done discreetly and yet with pressure, can achieve results. And it certainly has achieved results in the UK, where there's not a fixed legal quota you have to have, but yet the movement towards gender diversity and all kinds of diversity, including ethnic diversity, actually is working.
Actually, we have that story from The Economist because we're a UK headquartered firm, and Tony Blair, it was David Cameron in 2015 that said all companies need to now publish gender wage guideline, gender wage gap information. And The Economist published it at 29.5%, which is double that of the media average in the industry. And that was a huge awakening. And for me, it's very obvious that all my bosses are white male dominated, but for them, it was a real wake-up call. They had been blinded by this. And so, to your point, it is important for them to realize how far behind they are on the curve and the steps that they are making to get there.
And look at the mess the BBC got itself into with the very high rates that it was paying to male presenters as against very senior women bureau chiefs. For example, it was, I think, the man in Washington, D.C. was getting vastly more pay than the woman who was the bureau chief in Beijing. And the more that the BBC tried to explain it, the sillier it looked. But I think different things work for different contexts. Norway went up front with a quota for boards, and no reason to think their companies don't do well. But let's go a step further than that. Generally, the evidence is that the companies which have significant representation of women in these upper echelons with a board or management, they do pretty well. In fact, probably do better. And I think it's because of the strength of diversity. I mean, it stands to reason that if you're businesses in the business of trying to sell something, a product or a service, and if you have senior management and a board that is attuned to a much wider cross-section of the population, you have to do better than one that has a sort of deaf ear to half the population in the case of women or significant ethnic minorities. So I think in the end it'll be the economic case that wins out in the business world. People say, hey, they're doing pretty well. What's behind this? And really having champions of diversity in business speaking about what they believe it really brought to their company.
And to make that business case, to make that economic case, you know, a lot of companies use metrics like rate of return. So they build a business case for an ROI. You know, I get this as well from my CFO. What is the ROI on the event that you're holding? Or what's the ROI on the relationship that you're investing in? Companies do this for technology. They do it for sustainable development goals. Is it possible to do it for corporate diversity? I see companies shaking.
I think having an ROI, if I were a woman, I would find it so degrading. A woman is not a machine. It's not a robot. When you want to get married, do you ask yourself, when a guy wants to get married, does he ask, what's the ROI on my marriage? Or, well, I guess in the old days, it's what kind of dowry would I get? What's the ROI on having children? I think actually that's quite ridiculous. And it's giving way to a way of thinking which now requires women to have to justify that the norm, in fact, is a white male society. Do I want to justify that as a person of color? There's an ROI on my being a person of color? I think we have to recognize that diversity is itself a strength for a company. When companies actually have that diversity, they will see a positive impact on profitability, but not through direct ROIs. It's going to be through, as I've mentioned, it will be through resilience of a company at a time of stress. It will be in much higher associate engagement and associate happiness with a company. It will be through strategic breadth. When Diageo has its annual board meetings, the women contribute not just about consumer insights and areas that women are supposed to be stronger in. It's because their whole entire upbringing gives them a different perspective on everything. Mm-hmm. And all of us are diverse. And I think diversity itself is what makes a company strong. When you can convince boards and companies of that, then the ROI is there. But to have an ROI on investing in women or in sustainability, I think is highly degrading to the subject itself.
Good answer. And Gabrielle, did you want to weigh in on that? Because you see a lot of different companies. What has been successful in the narrative of promoting diversity in those companies? You've seen so many.
Well, I feel not so sure now, you know, because listening to everybody, I think that things like quotas or legislation on equal pay, it may not be ideal, and I would agree with you in that respect. But the truth is that we are not in an ideal world. And if in France we would not have put quotas, we would not have been at 44% of women on board. So it's not ideal. I don't like it. No one in this room would like to be a quota. But the reality is that maybe for a limited period of time, by the way, it changes the rules of the game. It changes the people you talk to. It changes the people you bring on board. So
I know we only have 2 minutes left, and I meant to wrap up all these various discussions into 2 minutes. But my takeaway really from listening to everyone here is that it's going to be about mindset and cultural change that has to drive not just in government, in society, but in businesses. They all have to put together their heads and really believe in the cause for diversity. As you were mentioning, Helen, about the economic case for diversity, I can think about the time in many years ago when Hollywood was already saying how female actresses were paid so much less than male actors, and nobody kind of blinked twice about it. Thought, well, okay, that's they bring in the money, so we should perpetuate that problem, because the society was not pushing for that change. I think it's very different now. I think there is a little bit more momentum in civil society and among the general public. It is a danger. We swing too much one way, because there are also research that shows, for example, that the Me Too movement now has swung a little bit against the victims, and people are saying that a lot of false claims on sexual harassment, for example, and they have actually not changed their attitudes towards gender diversity because of the Me Too movement. So there needs to be this balance. We can't move too fast, we can't move too slow. But as I sort of think about what we've discussed today, it's really about those mindset change. And if I could ask each of you to then say, in your own capacity, how do you think you can contribute to changing mindsets in the ways that, in the areas that you work in, whether it is on your own board, or whether it is within the confines of a foundation, or whether it's in politics, or whether it is in business. Maybe if I could ask Helen to start.
Just in a nutshell, I think it makes for better decision making to have good diversity, and also the role modeling effect for young people across our society of looking at significant bodies, whether it's their parliament, their cabinet, their major company boards, whatever, and they see themselves reflected in that. I think that's positive for social cohesion. So both for the range of perspectives that you bring to decision making and for the feeling, you know, we've all got a stake in this, the social cohesion. I think embracing diversity and inclusion makes so much sense.
Thank you. And Gabrielle, or should I ask KP to go first? Because I think, and Gabrielle, you want to close the conference, so I have KP to go first.
About what we can do in our own capacities?
Yes.
Well, I
change
suppose
mindset.
Obviously within areas where I have some influence over, organizations which I sit on the boards or chair or whatever, obviously one tries to change that mindset and change that culture from the very top itself.
And sitting on the Women's Forum.
Sorry?
And sitting here with us at the Women's Forum.
I was going to say the second thing is to be the token male at Women's Forum so that I can tell all my other male friends that it's not so bad, it's not so dangerous.
No, you've been wonderful. We were in the opening panel last year as well.
Well, I have a very strong woman president here who's managing to make me believe that if we all want to believe in change in this world, we as men have to also walk the talk.
Absolutely. Jerome, if I could come to you.
Just to say that we have a great responsibility today to enhance and speed up women's accountability, which is just logical, legitimate, and expected for an achieved world.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Gabrielle to share your concluding thoughts about what you'll be doing tomorrow, the day after, to be changing mindsets on diversity, but also as part of the Women's Forum management, to share a little bit about your thoughts of the last 2 days.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be very quick on what I will do after this conference, even if I will really do it. I will focus on young generation, both in my private life and professional life, to make sure that they have equal opportunities, whether they are boys or girls. Now, because I'm the president of the Women's Forum, I was asked to conclude this session and to share with you a number of things, like the fact that we had 120 speakers, more than 1,000 delegates coming from more than 50 countries. And I hope that you've all realized that the Women's Forum Asia has become even more ambitious this year, and that we've had extremely meaningful discussions on the most critical issues the region is facing. Maybe you were not all here on the first day, because we started with Youth Leaders Forum, dedicated to 100 future leaders aged from 18 to 28, and this was a huge success. Then we had 30 sessions, including very original and amazing experiences like Dialogue in the Dark, and a session with Sophia, the first human-like robot, designed with both artificial intelligence and emotional intelligence. I want to say a big thank you to the speakers here in the room and to all of you. I hope you had a good time, you made friends, and that now you're ready to engage for impact. I want to say just one thing, is that for the last 2 days, we've seen companies and governments committing for action here at the Women's Forum. We've seen the Singapore government committing to reduce emissions by 16% below business as usual level by 2020. We've seen big global companies like BNP, L'Oreal, signing the Women's Forum Charter on women leading climate action. We've seen the CEO of Schneider Electric committing for equal pay by 2020. We've seen P&G promising to spend $150 million on women-owned businesses. And not only these governments and companies are taking action, but all of you, I think, in the room are ready to do something when you're back in your family, your work, and your community. Now, you are all part of the Women's Forum community and friends, so I hope that you are going to join us for future events and that you will help us build a more inclusive and better world. Just to finish, before we all go for a drink, I want to thank all the teams that have organized this meeting. Of course, Publicis Live, but also the Women's Forum led by Chiara. And I think you can say bravo.